What if I told you that the often quoted boast of the de Havilland Mosquito is a complete lie? As much as we love the Mossie, we've all been egging it on for a role that it simply could never have fulfilled. Of course, I'm talking about the popular forum flex, the size of its bomb load, in comparison to its American cousin, the Flying Fortress. In this video, I'm going to review just how many bombs the Mossie and the B-17 could carry, and how far. I'm also going to share with you my detailed review of the actual bomb tonnage dropped by the B-17 on real-world missions. It took me about 2 days to collect that data. And finally, I'm going to explore just what the Mosquito Force would have looked like had it really had to replace the Flying Fortress. So stay with me while we finally answer this question. Could the Mosquito really carry more bombs to Berlin than the B-17? Well, obviously the answer is no, but stick around while I explain why it is a no. Firstly, let's talk about each of these aircraft's endurance and combat radius, as well as the bomb load it could carry to its limits. Here we are really looking at a few key factors: fuel capacity, cruising speed, and fuel consumption. The B-17F and G models could be filled with 2,780 US gallons of fuel, which included their outboard Tokyo tanks, which would have weighed approximately 16,680 pounds. A B-17's empty weight was 35,972 pounds, while its basic weight, including oil and other essentials for flight, was 37,672 pounds. This was raised to a combat weight of 41,000 pounds when the crew and the defensive armament were included. The absolute maximum takeoff weight for the B-17G was 67,860 pounds, but on the B-17F, the maximum operating weight was listed at 64,500 pounds in the manual. Nevertheless, a lot of information was given to pilots based on loadings of 65,000 pounds. This results in an available load of fuel and bombs of 24,000 pounds, or 26,860 pounds if you were tired of life. So fully loaded, a B-17 really had a limit of just over 7,000 pounds of bombs, possibly 12,000 if the top brass had lost their minds. But in reality, how far could it really carry that load? More on that coming up. The de Havilland Mosquito had a much more modest fuel load than the Fort. The Mossie had an internal fuel capacity of 423 imperial gallons, about 508 US gallons, which could be augmented by two 58-gallon drop tanks, 139 US gallons. This weighed in at 3,215 to 4,096 pounds. In reality, the Mosquito invariably carried those external drop tanks, and most of the literature covering its performance assumed that this was the case. In terms of endurance, let's look at the recommended settings from the respective manuals to understand just how far that fuel could take each aircraft. The B-17F manual gives us the following data. Based on a load of 60 to 65,000 pounds and allowing for 212 gallons for the warm-up on the ground, a B-17 flying at 140 miles per hour at 30,000 feet should fly from point A and arrive at point B 2,350 miles away with its remaining 2,568 gallons of fuel. This would give the B-17F a combat radius of around 1,175 miles while carrying at least 7,000 pounds of bombs. Could it get to the Big B though? That would certainly be within the range of a B-17 operating from RAF Grove in Berkshire, some 631.5 miles from Berlin as the crow flies. Why RAF Grove? It has to be one of the furthest US bases from the German capital and therefore a good example. When you reduce the weight of the B-17 to the 50 to 55,000 pound range, its combat radius increases, even if its bomb capacity goes down. Turning to the Mosquito now, could it fly as far as the Fort, or perhaps further? Here it gets a little tricky as there are so many variants of the Mosquito. Which one do you look at? For our purposes, we're really looking at the Mark B-4, Series 2, which was first delivered to number 105 Squadron in November 1941, and then really began service life later the following year. We're also talking about the 54 examples of the Mark B9, as well as the later Mark B16, of which 402 were built. The main difference between the variants were the engines. Earlier Mark B4s were fitted with either the Merlin 21 or 23, while the later variants got the Merlin 72, 76, or 73 and 77. These later engines could add up to £2,000 to the empty weight of the Mossie. The Mark B-16 manual suggests that a fully loaded Mosquito could climb to 30,000 feet in 50 minutes, in which time it would have travelled 180 miles and used 150 gallons of fuel. If, however, the plus £4 boost was increased to plus £7 and the RPM remained at 2,650, the same climb could be done in 35 minutes, but the ground covered would fall to just 120 miles. Importantly, the fuel consumed would be 40 gallons less. So if we deduct the 20 gallons needed for a warm-up and to taxi the aircraft, how far would the remaining 409 gallons of fuel get the Mossie? For the most economical cruise and thus the maximum range, it was recommended for pilots to fly at 220 indicated airspeed on the outbound legs and 210 indicated airspeed on the return. The RPM would be set to 1,900 and the boost held at below plus £4. Speeds could be above the suggested indicated airspeeds, but these engine settings at 20,000 feet would give the pilot 3 miles to the gallon on average. So at 20,000 feet and with 409 gallons of fuel in the tanks, a Mosquito could travel 1,227 miles fully loaded. That would give it a range of at least 673.5 miles. Again, even taking off from RAF Grove, a Mosquito would be expected to easily make a straight in and out run on Berlin. But there's a catch. The Mosquito Mark B4 and the Mosquito Mark B16 carried vastly different bomb loads. Also, the B-17 had several different configurations of bombs that could be loaded into its bomb bay. What would they really have been carrying to a target like Berlin? To an American armourer in the 8th Air Force, a B-17 bomb bay looked like this. The B-17F had 42 stations to which a bomb could be attached and then sequenced to drop by the bombardier. However, depending on the type of bomb, not all stations would be available to the armourer. Also, it's important to note that the B-17G had fewer stations and thus was unable to carry as many smaller bombs higher in the bomb bay racks. The largest internal bomb that could be carried was the 2,000 pound ANM-34 or ANM-66, the smallest, the 100 pound bombs of various designs. While it was possible to carry bombs externally on wing racks, this was not a common practice in the ETO. According to this diagram, the B-17 could carry two 2,000 pound bombs at stations 10 and 31, with two 1,000 pound bombs at stations 14 and 35. This would give a 6,000 pound bomb load. Two 1,600 pound bombs could be attached to stations 7 and 28, with a further 4 being attached to the overload stations 10, 18, 31 and 39. This would give a 9,600 pound bomb load. Nevertheless, I'm led to believe that the 1,600 pound bombs were less prevalent. Again, according to this diagram, 6 1,000 pound bombs could be comfortably mounted, as could 12 500 pound bombs. Also, it would appear that as many as 16 AN-358 500 pounders could also be attached to various stations in the B-17F. One can also assume that various other combinations of bombs could be mounted to reach other desired bomb loads. This is important for the real-life data that I'm about to share with you next. Before we jump into that, where did the often repeated statement that a Mosquito could carry the same bomb load as an average B-17 really come from? I'm very tempted to name Roger A. Freeman as the indirect culprit, the very man who popularised the 8th Air Force's famous nickname, the Mighty Eighth. In his book Mighty Eighth War Manual, he gives the maximum bomb load of the B-17F and B-17G on pages 153 and 159 respectively. According to Freeman, the F variant could carry a total of 9,600 pounds of bombs. The G variant could carry up to 13,600 pounds of ordnance. However, critically, he states the normal tactical bomb load of each was 4,000 pounds. And this, I believe, is where the myth germinated from. The incredible thing is that Freeman then goes on to contradict himself in a certain way with the data he provides in another book, The Mighty Eighth War Diary. In this great reference work, Freeman lists out each and every known 8th Air Force mission, including the number of aircraft involved, losses and claims, as well as reported tonnage of bombs dropped. I spent considerable time collecting the results of 684 individual raids and reports on individual B-17 bomber groups. The Mighty Eighth flew many more missions than this, but at times it was not clear how many bombs were reportedly dropped by B-24s flying with the B-17s. At other times the tonnage was not reported at all. Freeman also noted both how many B-17s were dispatched on the mission and how many actually flew to the target. However, this latter information isn't always provided, so my calculations are always based on all aircraft dispatched. Presumably, the tonnage of bombs is only those who departed friendly territory for the target, but as that isn't clearly said, my calculations are likely to be a little lower than what they should be. Bear this in mind as it makes the following data even more revealing. So if we take the average pounds of bombs dropped per B-17 on each of the 684 sorties I recorded, does it tally with Freeman's previous claim? Well, the average across the board is £4,410, and the median is £4,547 dropped. Pretty close to what Freeman claimed, to be honest. To put it another way, between 1942 and 1945, for the data I could gather, 72.2% of average B-17 bomb loads were in excess of £4,000. This drops to 32.3% of being in excess of £5,000 and 4.5% in excess of £6,000. Looking at the data month by month, you can see a definite increase in the size of the bomb loads that the B-17s carried, with a noticeable trend as the 8th Air Force grew and found its feet. Obviously, this is looking at the average bomb load, not the individual bomb load of every flying fortress, but it suggests that a large enough proportion were carrying bomb loads over £4,000. I'll let all the maths professors weigh in here and correct me on my knowledge of working with stats. Nevertheless, we can certainly see some months on this chart that show an average bomb load of less than £4,000, and even just £1,768 in October 1942. That must mean that the Mosquito had a bomb carrying capacity equal or superior to the B-17 during these periods, right? No. Wrong. So very wrong. Except maybe for October 1942. When the first Mark B-4s arrived at Swanton Morley in November 1941, they had been designed to carry 4 500-pound short-tailed bombs. This gave the Mosquito a more than adequate bomb load of £2,000 for a light bomber. While it is true that in 8 Group, 54 Mark B-4s were later converted to carry a 4,000-pound load, they only accounted for 18% of the 292 built. By the way, this modification took the form of bomb bay doors that bulged in order to increase the internal bomb bay space. Pretty clever. The same modification was carried on into mass production when 402 Mark B-16s were built. However, the first flight of prototype DZ540 in this configuration didn't happen until the 1st of January 1944. So looking at the numbers again, 94.9% of the data I collected suggests an average bomb load of over £2,000 across the entire period. That's 16 sorties, 11.3% out of the 142 I recorded between August 1942 and the end of December 1943. 18.6% of the sorties carried out from the 1st of January 1944 carried less than £4,000 on average to the target. Looking at the highlighted target in the myth, Berlin, how often could the Mosquito have carried more bombs to that target? I collected 23 data points on missions to the Big B, all of which occurred after the 6th of March 1944. In 21.7% of the missions, the average B-17 bomb load was less than £4,000. The highest average actually being £5,658 on the 26th of February 1945. On a side note, in terms of the biggest bomb loads, the top 3 largest average bomb loads of all the missions I recorded were as follows. On the 4th of April 1945, 24 B-17s from the 1st Air Division dropped 99 tons of bombs on the U-boat yard at Hamburg and Finkenwerder. This averages out to 8,250 pounds of ordnance per fault. On the 5th of June, 464 B-17s from the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Bombardment Divisions attacked Cherbourg and the Pas-de-Calais coastal defences. They dropped 1,896 tons of bombs, which worked out to be about 8,172 pounds of bombs per bomber. On the 30th of March 1945, one of the last 8th Air Force missions of the war, the 2nd Air Division dispatched 24 B-17s to bomb the U-boat yards at Farga. They dropped an average of 7,778 pounds of bombs that day. So far, I think we've seen there is a kernel of truth in the claim that the Mosquito could carry an equal or greater bomb load to the B-17. However, it was only true on a small percentage of raids, and the myth only really gained substance way after January 1944. What if the Mosquito had been asked to take on the burden of the American air offensive, at least for the B-17? What would that have looked like? In short, based on the data I collected, the Mosquito force would have had to have been 75% larger than the B-17 force that dropped the same tonnage of bombs between August 1942 and December 1943. Saying that, it would only have had to have been 16% larger from January 1944 to the end of the war if £4,000 cookies were exclusively used. This is of course working on the inaccurate assumption that large amounts of Mark B-16s were available from early January 1944. They simply weren't. If the B-17 force had been replaced by Mosquitoes, then there are some obvious advantages and some even more glaring disadvantages to consider. Firstly, for every B-17 that doesn't fly over occupied Europe, you have 8 men that can be used elsewhere in the war effort. You'd also gain an additional pilot being trained who could be sent off to fly different aircraft. There is also the obvious fact that Mosquitoes, within the true course of history, had a very low loss rate compared to other bombers. That is, until they got hit, then getting out was a nightmare. The question remains though, would these Mosquitoes, assuming a large enough force could be built, simply replace B-17s in their day job? If, however, Mosquitoes were sent out to target occupied Europe by night, which with the advancements in target marking and navigational aids would have been possible, what would be the result? I would argue that if the day offensive was abandoned in favour of night intruding Mosquitoes, the entirety of the Reich defence would have been turned against them. Interception techniques based on the Ville d'Assaut concept were becoming very effective against Mosquitoes by the end of the war. The biggest factor in their favour was that the Mosquitoes were generally few and far between, even if their attacks were regular. But single-engine night fighter pilots were getting better and better at intercepting them by 1945. No doubt these techniques would have been honed much earlier in the war had the Luftwaffe been faced by a mass Mosquito offensive. If Mosquitoes flew during the day, even with fast bomber escorts, the unarmed variants would simply have been decimated, despite their faster cruising speed. There's even the argument that their new predator would have been the Me-262, which I discussed in another video linked above. And ultimately, if the Americans began operating the Mosquito instead of the B-17, they would have had to fly them during the day. Since June 1943 and the mission laid out by the Point Blank Directive, the Mighty Eighth's chief objective was to destroy the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground. The Mosquito would have been the bait. Obviously there's more detail to it and the topic really deserves its own video. Those are my initial thoughts. Please let me know what your take is on the topic in the comments below. So there we have it. While true in some ways, it remains a myth that the Mosquito carried the same bomb load as a B-17 and might have been able to replace the 4-engine Flying Fortress in any meaningful way. Please support my channel by liking the video and subscribing for more future videos. Also, please let me know if I've successfully debunked this myth or not. For more crazy ideas about World War II bombers, check out my video on Freeman Dyson's interesting suggestion for RAF Bomber Command on screen now. It's a bit crazy.